And I think this group of people in particular are the ones who stand out the most for people when they look back at ancient Irish history. The Tuatha Dé Danann, translated by some to mean the people of the goddess Danu, or the people of the god Danann. And you often hear things written about them like, the truth was not known beneath the sky of stars, whether they were of heaven or of earth. They're always spoken about in this sort of mystical way. And no matter if you're reading the historical accounts or the legendary accounts, it always says that they had perfected magic, necromancy. They were very powerful individuals. The legendary accounts say that they came to Ireland riding on a dark cloud on the first day of Bealtaine, the festival of the fires, which is May Day. Their leader was a man who was known as Nuada, and they settled in the mountains of Connacht. And when they first arrived here in Ireland, there was a thick layer of mist and smoke covering them, protecting them, so the Fir Bolgs didn't know that they had arrived. These are the people who we know today as the fairy people, the invisible ones who live in the hills, the gods of Ireland, the men of day, the She, as in the Banshee. They are said to have brought with them not just the Lia Fáil, the Stone of Destiny, but 3 other treasures as well, one from each of the lands that they came from. The first meeting between the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fir Bolgs came from an encounter between 2 champions at a place called Magh. So once the Fir Bolgs had become aware that the Tuatha Dé Danann were there, they sent out a champion of theirs to go and meet them. And the Tuatha Dé Danann did the same. The Tuatha Dé Danann sent a guy called Bres, and the Fir Bolgs sent a man named Srang. And they approached each other with their spears firmly gripped and their shields held tight to their chests. Very slowly they walked towards each other, ready for battle. And Bres was the first to speak. And when Srang heard him speak, he realised it was Irish and he was speaking his own tongue. So he was less, on guard. They walked a bit closer to each other and they started to ask questions about each other's race and each other's family. It sounds pretty profound. But the truth is, the reason why they could speak the same language is because they were both descendants from the Magh. Where the Fir Bolgs went to south of Greece near Athens, the Tuatha Dé Danann went to north of Greece, Scythia, as I said earlier. And while they were there, they learned the magical practices of the Greeks, but they became much better at them, at these practices, than the Greeks themselves. And there was a war going on between the Scythians and the Greeks. And the Tuatha Dé Danann were helping the Greeks fight in this war. And how they were helping them was, at the end of every battle, they would go to the fallen soldiers on the Greek side and they would chant spells and incantations over them, and they would bring these soldiers back from the dead. And the Scythians, they were going to be destroyed because they couldn't, their soldiers were dying every day as well. And, they go back to the battlefield the next day and the same people that they killed yesterday are back fighting them again. So they went and they consulted a druid. And the druid said to them, and bear in mind, the book that I'm getting this information from is 300 years old, a lot older than the writing of Bram Stoker's Dracula. But he said to them that the only way to defeat them is if you drive a wooden stake through their heart, and if they don't rise up from the dead, then they are of the devil, and you will defeat them. But if they do rise from the dead, then they're of God, and there's nothing you can do to stop them. And that's out of Geoffrey Keating's book. So that's how they started driving stakes of wood into the bodies of the dead men after they killed them, and that's how they began to stop the Tuatha Dé Danann's powers, their spells. And now, because of what they had done, the Tuatha Dé Danann feared that they were going to be, killed and tortured and really badly treated by the Scythians for what they had done. So this is when they decided to leave Greece. The Fir Bolgs left because they were in slavery and they were getting mistreated. The Tuatha Dé Danann left because they were afraid that they were going to be killed for using magic against the Scythians. And the Tuatha Dé Danann headed to Scandinavia. And when they met the Scandinavian people and the people of those lands, witnessed the sort of power that the Tuatha Dé Danann had, the power that they had to speak to spirits and the power that they had over nature. They marvelled at what they could do, and they asked them if they would stay and teach their children how to do what they could do too. So they gave them 4 cities or centres of learning. One of them was called Murius, one of them was called Thalus, one of them was called Gorius, and the other one was called, I can't remember, it's gone out of my head, it'll come back to me. But basically these 4 cities were centres of learning that were given by the Scandinavians to the Tuatha Dé Danann to teach their children. As time went on, the Tuatha Dé Danann then left the Scandinavian countries. They left their 4 cities, and they took from each of these 4 cities an object, a sacred object. And before they arrived in Ireland, they actually went to Scotland first, and they lived in Scotland for 7 years. And then they finally arrived in Ireland, and when they got to the coast of Ireland, they set their ships on fire. And this setting the ships on fire, some people say, well, that's probably what the magical mist was. Who knows? See, this is what I'm saying. It's very difficult to look at this point in history with any certainty, because there's so much fantasy mixed with real historical data that it's we really need to be careful and precise about the information and be very critical about it, and be very critical and rational about this information. So the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fir Bolgs had this meeting, and the Tuatha Dé Danann said, well, look, if you give us half of the island, you can have the rest of it in peace. And if you don't give us half the island, well, we're going to take it by battle. So Sreng went back to the Fir Bolgs, and he said it to his king, who was King Yucad. And having consulted his council and his learned elders, what will we do? How will we deal with these new invaders who want half the island? They came back with the conclusion, we will not give up half this country to these strangers, for if we do, they will soon take the whole thing. So battle was inevitable at this point, and the preparations began, and both sides agreed to delay the battle so that they could make spears and armour that was like that of the others. So basically they had different weapons, they had different types of armour, different types of spears, and instead of just going to battle the next day, they allowed time for each of the sides to manufacture weapons and armour that was like that of the enemy. Could you imagine that happening today? Could you imagine, who's going to war? America, Syria, and they go, okay, we're going to go to war here, but we're going to let you have all the time you need to get the same amount of nukes we have and the same amount of tanks we have. And why would you do that? Why would you do that if you're going to battle? It doesn't seem right to us today, and I think the reason why it doesn't feel right is because we've drifted so far away from what is fair. That's why they were doing it. It's tactically unwise to let your enemy know what your capabilities are. Yet, in ancient Ireland, we see both sides willing to share their weaponry so that the battle might be more evenly matched. We see this really strange glimmer of fairness flickering through the darkness of a battle. And the idea holds that if one of those is going to be victorious, it's going to be because they were the best warriors, and they fought with the most passion and the most fury, and they rightly defeated the lesser opponent. And not because one side had bigger spears or tougher armour. Now, even though there was this element of fairness, it didn't stop the Tuatha Dé Danann mixing their magic with espionage, and they secretly sent 3 of their queens, Bab, Magh and the Morrigu, into Tara, which was the seat of government for the Fir Bolgs and for many kingdoms thereafter. And by the power of their enchantments they brought mists and clouds of darkness over the whole place, and they sent showers of fire and of blood over the people, the way they could not see or speak with one another through the length of 3 days. So they basically went in and did magic to confound and confuse their enemy, the Fir Bolgs. It was midsummer's morning when the armies were ready, and they assembled at Magh, County Sligo. Each side sent 9 times 9 hurlers into battle, so they sent 81 hurlers into battle, agreeing that this would be the set number to fight each day. And then we see that glimmer of fairness flickering again. Not only will they have similar armour and similar weapon, both sides would be evenly matched at the beginning of every new day. There was really no contest here against the superior skill of the Tuatha Dé Danann. The Fir Bolgs were defeated. And during the battle, King Nuada of the Fir Bolgs was overcome by this really terrible thirst from the enchantments and the spells that the Tuatha Dé Danann had been placing on him, and he couldn't find anywhere to quench his thirst, to find water. And while he was looking for this water, he was basically pursued, and he was slain by the enemy. And in this battle, King Nuada of the Tuatha Dé Danann, it wasn't just the Fir Bolgs did give a good fight, and they managed to sever the arm of Nuada. And there was this custom throughout ancient Ireland that a king could not have a blemish. If you had a spot or a mark or a bruise, or if you were missing an eye or a hand or an arm, you could not be king, because the king had to be the closest embodiment of perfection that you could have. So he didn't die, but according to these ancient laws, he could not be the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann. He was disqualified. And instead, the Tuatha Dé Danann appointed the champion known as Bres, who I mentioned earlier, as their new leader. What's interesting about Bres was that he is the son of one of the members of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and also the Fomorian king Eletha. So he's half Fomorian and half Tuatha Dé Danann. Once the battle was finished and the Fir Bolgs were defeated, the Tuatha Dé Danann, they were moved by the Fir Bolgs' spirit and their nobility and their valiance in battle, that they allowed the Fir Bolgs to have 1/4 of the island, and they chose Connacht. While all this was going on, you still had this other group of these strange characters, and they weren't pleased with the new change of government. I'm talking about the Fomorians. And what they done was, because Bres, who was now king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, he was like related to them, they started to manipulate him and use him for their own benefit. He was weak, and he folded under the pressure of these Fomorians, who was basically like their political puppet, and they used him to impose the harsh tax on the Tuatha Dé Danann again. It's like the tax that they placed on the Nemedians before. They had to give 2/3 of all their crops, all their cattle, and all their children to the Fomorians. So Bres was a very bad ruler. He made his champions do work that they shouldn't have done, like carry firewood or build a rath. He didn't stand up to the Fomorians. He didn't defend the Tuatha Dé Danann at all. After the battle, Nuada began the recovery process, and with the help of his physicians, he eventually got his arm restored, fixed, and it was made of silver. And again, I'm trying to put this into a modern context. Is this like biotechnology? Is this like, you lose a leg and they give you a new leg, like a robotic leg that you can walk around? Is this like an ancient idea of some sort of biotech? I have to ask the question, where does the history and the legend, where do they separate? Did Nuada exist? Was he a real man that existed? If he existed, did he actually lose his arm in battle? If he lost his arm in battle, did he actually have it restored through magic and science to have a silver arm? Well, it took 7 years for him to heal anyway, and now that he was unblemished, he reassumed his position as leader of the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and he ruled Ireland for a further 20 years until he would finally be beheaded in a battle by the Fomorian king Balor of the Evil Eye. Notorious for his strength and described as a giant, this Balor of the Evil Eye, or of the mighty blows, is described to us as having one eye on the back of his head that caused destruction to all that came within its glare. He is said to have lived on Tory Island, which is off the northwest coast of Donegal. And to this day, the island's highest point is associated with Balor. It is called Tor Moor, or the High Tower. and it's believed to be the location of the legendary Crystal Tower in which Balor imprisoned his daughter Etlín upon hearing a prophecy that he would be killed by a grandson. Should point out at this stage that J.R. Tolkien got a lot of his inspiration from these sort of legends, the Norse and Celtic and Gaelic legends. And Balor of the Evil Eye, who lives in the High Tower, is a lot like the symbolism and a lot like the themes that you see in Lord of the Rings. So because there was this prophecy that Balor's daughter would have a child who would end up killing him, so he decided to lock her up in this tower, and there's still evidence of it's still referred to on Tory Island today as Tormore. But what happened was one of the members of the Tuatha Dé Rule called Keating, using magic, he assumes the form of a woman, and he successfully enters Etlín's chamber, an encounter that would leave her pregnant with triplets no less. And once Balor heard about this, he just threw the infants into the sea from the tower, but one of them is saved by this druidess of the Tuatha Dé Rule. And this baby will become a very important character in Irish history. This baby would be known as Lugh Lawfada, which means Lugh of the long arm. As an infant, he would be fostered by the Fir Bolgs queen Tailtu and the magical Danann Magh. As a man, he would approach the Tuatha Dé Rule seated at Tara, and he would claim to be the master of the arts, or the Ildánach. Having been sort of kicked off the throne and dispossessed of his title, Bres sort of fecked off to the Fomorian side, and he started to get assistance from them and started to raise an army to attack the Tuatha Dé Rule. They were still under that harsh tax. But when Lugh, this strange Ildánach, this brilliant man, arrived at Tara, he had this energy with him, he had this fire in his belly, and he spurred them on to fight back. And they secretly began preparing for battle. They were determined to put an end to the tyranny of the Fomorians. So the men of Ireland assembled just in time for Halloween, just before that dreaded tax was due. Could you imagine having to give up 2/3 of all your produce, your crops, your cattle, and most importantly your children? 2/3. So there was a mighty clash and a din as the battle began just on the eve of Halloween. And the figures say that there was 180,000 men led by Lugh Lawfada and the Tuatha Dé Rule. And they got a victory at the place called Moytara. But sadly, although they had a victory against the Fomorians, their beloved leader Nuada is slain by Balor. But once Nuada is slain, Lugh steps up and fulfills the prophecy. It's very much, the story I'm about to tell you now is very reminiscent of the story in the Old Testament of King David. King David, who fought against Goliath the giant. Well, Balor is described as a giant, and in this account, the Irish account, Lugh Lawfada uses a slingshot to slay his grandfather, just like in the Bible with David. Except this story is a little bit different, because he hits Balor so hard with this stone that it knocks his evil eye out of the back of his head, and it lands facing the direction of the Fomorians. And as I said earlier, anything that this eye looks at, anything that falls upon its gaze, is destroyed immediately. So the Fomorians there was just havoc in the Fomorian ranks. They were decimated by their own leader Balor because of this brilliant shot of Lugh Lawfada, the Ildánach, the master of the arts. Having been defeated in this way, the Fomorians start to flee Ireland. But Lugh is having none of it. He gets another couple of characters called Ogma and the Dagda, and they go after the Fomorians who had stolen this magical harp. The Tuatha Dé Rule are said to have ruled Ireland until around 1500 BC. There's no reason to think that these are not absolutely a real bunch of people, historically verifiable people. There's no reason to doubt that. All of our evidence, all of our text says that they were real people. But whether they had magical powers, you can't believe those things in the modern world. You can't say, oh yeah, they were magical in this modern world, like. But that's what the accounts say about them. After Lugh lost Fada, there would be 6 more kings, as Lugh was declared their king, having won such a glorious battle. There would be 6 more kings, and 3 of them were brothers who shared title by rotating it. So there were these 3 brothers, and these would be the last of the high kings of the Tuatha Dé Danann. They shared their reign, so they were all high king at the same time, but they just took 1 year on, 2 years off. They were called Mythical, Magh, and Magh. And it was these 3 men who each took wives whose names would be given to Ireland. So Mythical, Magh, and Magh, you had Fola, Bamba, and Eru. And they successfully ruled Ireland in this way for several years, until the descendants of a man called Mill arrived.